When I was taken to their villages in the east, I was treated very well, as many captives were treated. You see, when someone lost a child, it was important to replace that child. And so oftentimes children were kidnapped to replace a lost child, as I was so kidnapped. And in that process, the children are treated as part of the nation, the tribe. So it was among the Hidatzas that I lived. And I married this man named Toussaint Charbonneau. And they said that he bought me. Some say he won me in a gambling game. Well, let me tell you about being purchased. Among the Hidatzas, when a young woman marries, the man sends a spokesperson to the village, to that house, to that lodge, and says to the families, I want your daughter to be married to Toussaint Charbonneau for these reasons. And they give gifts to the family. So my family was given gifts. And when those gifts are accepted, then the family that I was staying with have to prepare a feast. And in that feast, they prepare corn and squash and beans and all sorts of food to feed the relatives of Toussaint Charbonneau. And so we took the food to them, and as is customary among the Hidatzas, I carried a bowl of corn, and I put it in front of him as my gift, my acceptance. And then my family also gives gifts. But nobody talks about the gifts that are exchanged. They only talked about the fact that Toussaint Charbonneau purchased me with gifts. And I say, I wasn't purchased. The Hidatzas women are taught to be proud, are taught to be independent, and all of our lives we grow up learning about how to take care of things. It is the women in the Hidatsa villages that I lived in. It is the women who build the earth lodges. You see, women have great power. And so the women in Hidatsa villages have many things to contribute to life. Well, when Lewis and Clark came among us, they acted like they were the first Bashjile that we ever saw. But they weren't. They weren't. For several hundreds of years we had seen the Bashjile, the white men. Our oral traditions talk about them. One of the stories of our origin says, at one time the entire earth was covered with water. And on that water walked two spirits, Lone Man and First Creator. And as they walked across that water, Lone Man and First Creator saw a duck swimming along the water, and they said, "How is it that you live?" And the duck said, "Down below, underneath the water, way down there, there is earth." And so Lone Man said, "Go down and get me some." So the duck swam down there, picked up some sand and put it in his hand. And Lone Man said, go again. And so the duck dived and picked up some sand and brought it back and put it in his hand. And he said, that is enough for me, but I need some for First Creator. So the duck swam down again and came back up and put the sand in his hand. He said, that's almost enough. One more time. So for the fourth time, that duck dived under the water and came back up, put that sand in his hand. And Lone Man took that sand and gave some of it to First Creator and said, go, create the world. So First Creator went out and blew on his sand, and he made this land that was flat. Not many trees. Lakes. No rivers. Animals. Elk, deer, buffalo. He looked at it, he thought it was wonderful. Lone Man, in the meantime, had made mountains and trees and rivers and streams and fish that would swim those rivers and lots of deer and elk and animals, birds and little ones that crawled underneath the earth. When they came back together, Lone Man said to First Creator, did you create the world? First Creator said, yes. He said, good, let's go look at it. So when they went to look at it, Lone Man said, but it's so flat, there's no trees. What will the people use for wood to build their lodges? So he made trees. And then Lone Man said, there's no hills. There's no way that the wind will protect these people. So First Creator stomped his heel all over the place, and he made that land now that they call the Badlands. And when that was done, they said, good. Lone Man said, come see what I made. And so they went to see. And it was wonderful, the mountains and the trees. Everything looked good. They were both very pleased. But as they walked along, they came across this funny-looking animal that had black and white spots and horns that came around like this. And Lone Man said to First Creator, did you make that? First Creator said, no. So Lone Man said, it's a living thing. We'll take it and put it on the other side of the big water. Someday it's going to come back here, and that might be the only thing we have to eat. So they walked on. They came to this dead animal. It was covered with maggots, white maggots with red heads. And Lone Man said to First Creator, did you make that? First Creator said, no. But it's a living thing. Let's take it and put it on the other side of that big water. Someday it will grow up to be like the white man and have red hair. And it will come back and use our people, eat our food. And so, what color hair did Clark have? He had red hair. So this myth that maybe she was in love with him, well, I keep thinking about that old story about the one who had come back with the red hair and live among us, use our people, eat our food, take from us, and maybe never give things back. Well, my journey with the expedition, let me think. What can I tell you about? You know, if it wasn't for me, there would be many times that they would not have been successful. It is said that they took me along because my family were Shoshone. They had many horses. And that I would be good to be able to communicate with them. And that it would be good to have me along as well, so that other Indian nations would know that this was not a war party, because war parties didn't take women and children into battle. Well, did you know that women fought in battle alongside the Indian men? That we could be warriors? And that there are many instances of Indian women who would fight beside their men. I was always prepared to do that. That was part of my life on the plains. And you all know that I gave birth before I left to a son, Baptiste, they called him, Pomp. Well, they don't tell you about the times when, we carried him, perhaps the other men carried him. It always made it seem like I was the only one who carried him. And then, in growing up, what happened to him? Those are things that, he went, in my journey with Clark and Lewis, it was Clark who liked my son and said that he would educate him and bring him up into the ways of the white men. And I thought that was good. So, in my journeys with these men, there were so many times when they came among us, they didn't know very much about what was out here. They didn't know any of the plants, the roots to dig, the berries to pick. And yet that was our life. That was the way Indian women were taught. Even as children, you had to survive. So you had to know what roots to dig and what berries to eat. And so I started to show them those kinds of things. And as an Indian woman growing up on the plains, you're always taught to look, observe, see things. Pay attention to what you see, because your survival and the survival of all your family depends on that. So I was always watching for things. When the boat almost capsized at the falls, I knew that bag was important to Lewis, Clark, the one that contained all those instruments. And yes, there were many times when I would overhear a few things and listen to see if Toussaint remembered to tell them. Many times Toussaint forgot to tell them things. So sometimes I remembered that. There was a time when my people were going to hunt buffalo and they didn't know it. And I told Toussaint, I said, you got to tell them. They're leaving tomorrow. They'll take all those horses and go. So those were some of the things, mistakes perhaps, that I was always aware of. When we look at the journey and the places that I remember, the only thing I remembered was that Beaver Head Rock. That Beaver Head is, we see it as shaped like a beaver swimming in the water, and all you see is the head and the ears that stick up. And so that I knew then that was where my people would be, the Shoshone. And today when you go there, you can still see that rock. It's still there. And further on, about 12 miles, 15 miles maybe, there is that spot where we met my brother, Kamehameha. It's underwater now because the Bashjile build a reservoir there. But that spot where we met is there. It's a sacred spot to us. I remember that. That's where my brother saved us. We were hungry. We needed horses. We knew we had to cross that big mountain. Well, I went with Lewis and Clark instead of staying with my family. You see, when I married Toussaint Charbonneau, that meant that I was committed to him. And so therefore, I had to stay with him, even as he journeyed to that big water. But I also wanted to see that big water. I also wanted to see that big fish. I remember standing there on the shore and they were talking about the whales out there, and they were going to leave me. And I said, well, I've come all this way with you guys. I've helped you with food, clothing, and now you're going to leave me so I won't see that big fish? Well, they took pity on me and took me with them. So I saw many things. And people often wonder what I did with my life after that. Well, I stayed with Toussaint until we went to St. Louis to live after the expedition. And then, you know, Clark had always offered us to take us to St. Louis to educate our son. And I went with him. And here's where history becomes a little murky, because did I go back with him? It is said that he had a Snake Indian wife with him when he came back upriver, and that she died at the age of 26. Well, I lived to be an old lady. So, knowing Toussaint Charbonneau, I don't know who that woman was, but she certainly wasn't Sacajawea. And you know, he had this bad reputation of being a man who liked women. You know, in those days, a man could have several wives. And with the work we had to do, I welcomed 2 or 3 more women around. So, you see, there were reasons for having many women. And that Bashchile, when they came, they brought disease. And many of my village died of that smallpox. And as more women and children and old ones died, there were many women left without men. And so one man could have several wives, and that way you could create more children and bring more children into the world. So we had to compensate for those things. One of the things that I remember as well is that children belong to the mother's clan, and to the mother's clan also belongs her sister's children. So my sister's children become my children. When we visited my brother Kamehameha, I found that all my family had died while I was gone, and that only one son of my sister had survived, Basia. And so I took him as my son, because that was our tradition. Sisters became mothers to all of their children. Now, it has been said that Kamehameha was my cousin. Well, among my people, cousins are brothers. Okay, especially cousins whose mothers are sisters. So, if he was my cousin, I don't know that word among my people. We don't have a word for that. Your mother's sister is your mother. Your mother's sister's children are your brothers and your sisters. So I don't know this word cousin. He was my brother. And brothers are very important in the life of a young woman. Brothers have the right to, speak out whether a man mistreats you. Do you know that time Toussaint Charbonneau slapped me? And Clark reprimanded him. Well, let me tell you, if we had been in the village, my brothers would have beat him up. See, for such behavior. So in all those times of traveling, when I was away from my brothers and my sisters, those were things that I missed. But you can believe that night that Toussaint slapped me. He didn't have a very good meal that night either. You know, I knew a lot about plants. I knew a lot about how to cause some problems. So, there were many things that went on that trip. I remember when the fleas were so bad. You know, those Bashchile, those white men never took a bath. And the fleas would crawl all over them. When I lived with the Hidatsa people and the Shoshone people, every morning you had to jump into the river and wash. Clean off so that you would get rid of certain smells and certain insects wouldn't be attracted to that. And for the mosquitoes, that was another problem in the expedition. Mosquitoes. Well, we would just put mud on us, see, keep the mosquitoes from biting us. People thought we were dirty, but that was what worked really good. That was the first mosquito repellent. See, it was easy to find, but we could wash it off every day and at night. So, in my life with the expedition, I saw many things, heard many things, patiently watched and wondered. And I know that today in history, when you look at all the books, there are so many mountains and rivers and things that, they always have names. And yet, I only had one river named after me. And I don't know how many motels. And the other thing is, they always have me going like this. This'll be me. 200 years it's been almost since that expedition. And they still have me going like this. They say, guiding them. I was pointing that way to leave the country for them. Go, I said. You know, we didn't exactly invite them. And so we didn't exactly want them to stay either. So we'd always say, go over there. Over there you'll find that big water. So, anyway, are there any questions you might have of me? I have so many things I could talk about, but perhaps there's something that interests you. There are stories I could tell. Yes. Did I get to see the big whale? Oh, yes. Big fish. Yes. No, Nyanuki was not my friend, but I hear tell she was a very nice girl. And there's a mountain named after her, too. Question. No. In that long journey, when you think about it, it took 8-9 months to get there. Well, there's certain plants you can use out there to keep from having children. We controlled the number of children that we would have because in those times, the times were so hard that we could only raise 1 or 2. We'd have to space them. And by the time I thought about it again, Toussaint Charbonneau was off with somebody else. So that was fine with me. Question here. What kind of tribe was I? Shoshone. That's a good question. What kind of tribe? They've called me a snake Indian. Well, we did eat a few snakes. And we ate some mountain sheep. So that's like, some people called us sheep eaters. Some people called us, fish eaters. So it was whatever they saw people eating. I wonder what they would have called us if we'd been eating turkeys when they wrote about us. Yes. My son, he was a fine young man. He went to school in Europe, but he came back to the country that we lived in, and he and Basile stayed with me. When I was an old woman, it was so nice to have them around me, and I could tell them stories of the times when they were little, the places that they had seen. He was a good son. What country did I live in? This one. All of this country belonged to the Indian people. So it was ours. And you know that Louisiana Purchase that they talk about? That only gave the great father Jefferson claim to the land. It only gave claim. And then it had to be purchased from each of the Indian nations separately. You think about that. Somehow they forgot to tell you all that it still had to be bought. Okay. Charbonneau? Yes. Well, let's see. Clark spelled it Charbono. Charbonneau. Some people say Charboneau. See? Question. What kind of roots did we eat? When we were across the other side of the big mountains, we ate camas. We came to the camas prairie. It looks like a iris plant. When you see it growing in the field, it turns blue. And it's a beautiful flower. And when you dig that, there's a bulb on the end of it, and you could eat it. We ate wild carrots, wild onions. We had, all sorts of plants that we could eat that had the roots on it. Okay. Wild potato. Yes, there's a question, a little boy back here with red hair, no less. How old was what? My son died, I don't know, in his 60s, I believe. Question in the back. I spoke Hidatsa, Shoshone, English, French. 4. Yes. Pardon me? Where's the Beaver Rock? It's in a place called Dillon, Montana, along the Beaverhead River. Oh no, that's maybe 1,000 miles from there. The Fort Peck Reservoir is on northeast corner of Montana. Beaverhead Rock is way south near Yellowstone Park. Yes, yes. Question here?
I know the white people of today consider you a very historical person, and I'm just wondering if the natives of today, how do they see the role in the tradition?
The natives of today see it as an adventure. It was something that I did with my life. But the American Indians do not see me as a heroine. I don't see myself as a heroine. I'm just an ordinary Indian woman who was trying to survive those times. And so I'm not special. And even when you look at Lewis and Clark's journals, they don't mention me very often because they were white men, I guess, writing history, as is the problem with most of history today. Question? Yes, over here, this little boy. No volcanoes erupted while I was around, but I sure got mad a few times. Yes. Question over here. Yes, we had the Appaloosa, but we got it from the Nez Perce. You know, one thing that history forgets to tell you is that, yes, the Shoshones, the Hidatsas, all of those people at one time, they were fighting each other. But they became friends. The Hidatsas, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, they're all friends. The Nez Perce beadwork looks like the Hidatsa beadwork. The Hidatsas are related to the Crows of Montana. They're the same group, only they broke in half. One group came to Montana. So there is this connection with all of our allies as we go west. Okay. Question here? Do I know anybody by that name? Of course. That's my name. Question? After I was kidnapped, no, did not see my parents again. Question way over here. You mean when they wrote about him on that rock? That was one thing I couldn't understand. You know, those explorers, they were always climbing these high rocks and writing their name in there. You know? And so I didn't understand why they did that. Because those rocks, we believe, are sacred. Rocks have energy. Rocks are sacred because they were here before any else was here, before there was anything else. But there they named that Pompey's Pillar after my son. It's still there today. You can still go there and see the name there. It's near a place called Billings, Montana. Question here. Who taught me what to eat? All of the grandmothers. All the grandmothers. That's what you had to do, was spend your day doing that. Yes. How many horses did my tribe have? Oh, several hundred. Okay. Well, I would like to come out of character now and talk to you for a little bit about this character. So, let me change here. Hello. Yes, it's a wig. My name is Jeannie Eder. This is the first time I've put this character together. And thank you. I've avoided doing Sacajawea for 17 years. And the reason being is that I felt that Sacajawea was always a heroine of the white culture and not of the Indian culture. And that it would be hard to portray her as something different. And as I've started putting her together, the first thing you do when you put a historical character together is you study everything that's been written about them. And perhaps one of the best books is this one by Harold P. Howard called Sacajawea. And it talks about and elaborates a little bit more on her experiences in the expedition according to what's in the journal. There's really very little in the journals about her. And so a lot of the things that I talk about would be what any ordinary Indian woman living at that time would have experienced. And certainly she would have been independent, she would have been powerful, she would have known roots and berries and trees and a lot of things. And so I attempt to kind of portray her as a normal Indian woman, but yet try and deal with some of the myths about her, which is, I don't think there's any getting around her, that she's one of the most popular women in the country in terms of statues and such that are constructed to her. So I decided after this long to maybe just go with the flow and do her. As an Indian woman historian, I've spent a lot of time reading about her. And as a child, I lived on a Shoshone Indian reservation. And as a child, like many of you, I asked the old people, is Sacajawea buried here? Did Sacajawea live here? And I remember my stepfather, who's non-Indian, took me to visit the elders, and they took me to the cemetery to show me her burial and to talk about her. And they believe that she came back to them and lived and died with them and lived to be a very old woman. And so as a child, I was influenced by that, and that influences my interpretation of her. Okay. Any questions? Yes? What are some of the other characters I do? I do a really old Indian woman, a real person. It's easier historically to do real people than it is to do made-up ones. I do Wahini Buffalo Bird Woman, or Mahiduia. There were two books written by her in the 1900s by Gilbert Wilson. And he was an anthropologist who lived among her people. And all of his field notes are in the Minnesota Historical Society. But she lived from 1839 to 1929. Okay. So I portray her as an old woman, and I have a different costume, etc. Then I portray Zit Kalasha, or Redbird. Zit Kalasha was a 1920s political activist. Her English name was Gertrude Simmons Bonin. And she studied at the Boston Conservatory of Music, was educated in white missionary schools, became very influential in the politics of the early 1920s and 30s, pressed for Indian Citizenship Act, and she's an entirely different kind of character. Although she dressed traditionally when she spoke and gave her speeches, she really hits the white culture very hard. Okay. So those are the other two characters I do. Questions? And I travel with Mark Twain in the summer. And I see him over here. And so I'll be traveling with him again this summer, I hope. Okay. Question? In the back, way in the back is a little girl. Pardon me? Have I done any plays? Not for a long time. I usually do one-woman shows. It's very rare as well that you find an Indian person who will get on stage and portray a character. When I did Wahini, I stayed with Wahini's grandsons, who were in their 60s at the time, to really study her and to really give her character some authenticity. And that's something that as a historian I'm really aware of. And so I try to be as fairly accurate as possible and sensitive to the culture. But I think my experience as an academic historian, as a professional, give me this medium as a way to teach. I'd rather do this than lecture because it's a more fun way to teach and reach people. Okay. Questions?
I have a question. Does the modern day Indian use any herbs today?
Oh yes. Does the modern day Indian use herbs today? Yes. Very much so. In fact, 200 or so of the plants that Lewis and Clark came back with were used by Indian people. Okay. So we still know those plants. We still study those plants. We still have the old grandmas who will take us out and point at a plant and say, oh, this you can use for backache, or you can take the bark of the willow tree and chew on it. That's really good. It's the same as aspirin. You can, do a number of things. Chew them up and put them on as a poultice to stop bleeding. We're still aware of all that. Question over here.
At this particular point in time, do you think the Indian culture, the people who are Native Americans, are beginning to regain some of their pride, and I guess at that same time some confidence in their culture? Are they going back to that extent, or are they still in great grief and under stress?
Well, Native peoples are still under great stress. We're still fearful of letting the white world know about our ceremonies and what we're doing for fear of oppression. But we've always kept those ceremonies and those traditions. And we don't believe that we ever lose anything. As the white man's concept of losing things, that's not the same concept that we have. We believe that everything returns to us the same way it came the first time. So if it came in a dream or a vision from the spirit world, then the spirits will find someone who they can teach that to. And so it won't be, quote, lost. Okay. And you had a question over here. What was it? Yes, Sacagawea's tribe was very much a part of the trade network, as all of the Indians were at that time throughout the United States. They would trade, they just had this massive trade network among East Coast Indians, Great Plains, West Coast, just as we have major highways right now. Most of those are on old Indian trails used for trade. Question? Way in the back.
Did you make your dress?
Yes, I did. It's also very hot. So, any more questions? Yes? Where was Sacajawea buried? She's buried at Fort Washakie, Wyoming, on the Shoshone Indian Reservation. Okay. And her son supposedly is buried in a cave somewhere on the reservation as well. Question here. How old am I really as Jeannie Eater? 48. Okay. Well, thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Okay, thanks.